creating art in some sense says that we're looking towards a future. There's a different future out there. And then that's what imagination's about, is imagining something new. So if we're stuck in that old story, there is hope that we can get out of that. And we all have this imaginative capacity. Everybody has it to some extent. I said, even if you just make one mark on paper, you've expressed something. And it may not necessarily be creative, but you're starting that process of imagination because you've taken that first step.
Welcome to Beyond Theory, a podcast powered by Meadows Behavioral Healthcare that brings you in-depth conversations from the front lines of mental health and addiction recovery. I'm David Condos. After experiencing trauma, it can be challenging to start talking about what happened. But one way to overcome that is to find other ways to express yourself. So as an art therapist, how does Dr. Cathy Malchiodi use color, sound, and movement to help people tell their stories and start to heal? Let's get out of the abstract and see how this applies in the real world. It's time to go beyond theory.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cathy Malchiodi. I'm a psychologist and expressive arts therapist who works with trauma.
All right. Well, Dr. Malchiodi, thank you so much for being with us at the U.S. Journal Training Conference in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so let's start with your story, your background, kind of the journey you took to being interested in art, in your case, and doing what you're doing today.
Yeah, it's actually expressive arts therapy, but I actually started out as a visual artist, as an undergraduate. And even before that, I think as a child, I realized that the arts were really helpful to me in other ways. In recovering from loss and trauma as a child. And I think I was lucky that my family encouraged me in that direction, just intuitively knowing that that was helpful for me.
And so did you realize that at the time that it was helpful?
I did in some ways realize by the time I was an adolescent that it really helped untangle my emotions. But my first encounter was losing a very close family member, a grandmother, and that was the first death I ever experienced. And my father intuitively gave me a paintbrush and old paint from the house and let me paint in the basement on a wall. And I remember that so vividly about what was happening in that moment and being allowed to do that. But I also knew it was not just the painting itself, it was the fact that I got to move with the paintbrush across the sort of a canvas, being that cellar wall. And, that from there, I always moved towards the arts. So not just visual art, but also music, drama, theater, movement, in particular, dance. Yeah. So all those things I retained. So when I went to art school and became an artist, visual artist, I still felt the need to really take that further and really started to think, well, I could teach, so I could interact with people that way. But at that time, fortunately for me, it was kind of a synchronicity. There were programs opening up called art therapy graduate degrees at master's level. So I thought immediately, without even knowing what that was, I knew that was what I wanted to do. So I was quite lucky in that way to take it in that direction. And then from there, it just continued to snowball. My first work was with trauma, with children who were abused, children who had witnessed domestic violence, probably parents also who had quite a few addictions and other challenges. Then I continued in the mental health area, keeping my own art alive as a piece of what I do for myself, but realizing that this was a really important piece for those children and actually for those adults that I saw in those facilities.
Yeah. And so as you were kind of having that realization, what was it that made you see the connection for how art could have this profound impact on mental health and trauma?
I guess the earliest experience and not having training in trauma, because it was not standard at that time, even in mental health. And there was also a message given to us, even working in the first facilities that I worked at with children, that maybe we didn't really want to talk about what happened to them, because maybe it would be best if they just forgot. That was actually the statement that was made back decades ago.
So just kind of leave it under the rug. Don't stir it up.
Yeah. Don't stir it up. But one of the things I also saw, too, they did not want to talk. I knew they had stories that were really painful. So immediately I started to see that in the art, and they're using puppets, using all kinds of different art-based expression, that they were expressing things about what happened to them. So it was really obvious that there was something that needed to be expressed, but to express it through talk was not comfortable. Fast forward now, and with the work of people like Bessel van der Kolk, I also studied with early trauma specialist Lenore Terr. They knew that there was a reason. There was probably a brain reason when they didn't know exactly why. The brain said, don't talk. You can't talk. This is too powerful. It's too overwhelming. You can't express it through language. And Bessel, in studies that he'd done with other researchers, found that to be true, that there was a part of the brain, a language part of the brain called Broca's area, that actually shut down when you tried to get people to talk about very, very traumatic events. So all this kind of like, wow, what I'm presenting to them as an alternative way of communicating probably has a really important place in this work. And that's where we come to 2020. And here we are really starting to accept this as proven by neuroscience and neurobiology that we do have this implicit experience that's nonverbal, but we can get it out in these ways through the expressive arts.
Yeah. And so this is something that you've seen in other people. So you said it's something that you felt yourself. Mm-hmm. Could you describe kind of that, like how did it make you feel? Like to be able to get it out, to be able to use this, expressive arts, as you're saying?
Well, I think that's a good question, because we're just finding out there's a lot of levels to this. So one level is if you find an art form that is relaxing and calming to you, it's self-regulating. And to just have that piece is a pretty important piece when you can turn to something that you can do with your hands or with your body or with your voice in some way that starts to lower that anxiety, that starts to moderate that anger, starts to maybe even increase your feeling of aliveness and take down that depression. So there's that level. But there's other levels to it too. There's the level of being able to put something out, a message, an experience in a way without words so that it can be witnessed. And I work right now with active military and veterans. And this is a really important piece for them, to be able to get those things out that have happened to them in combat or some of the struggles they've had about being in the military, and express that in a way that you and I can witness that and we can actually start to understand their story. So that's another powerful level to it as well.
Yeah, and so it's like our bodies and our minds are crying out to communicate this, to have a connection with someone else about this. Huh.
Yeah, exactly.
So another phrase that you've used related to the presentation that you gave was how expressive arts can have this cultivation of the imagination element to it. And that's interesting because that word imagination is not something that I hear a lot in this context, talking about, healthcare, mental health. Why is that important? Like why, what role does that play?
Well, I think when you look at the continuum of recovery, so there's all this process going on, like I just mentioned about being able to be self-regulated, being able to feel safe in your body. So some of those things we work on initially in the expressive arts. And then, the pieces about maybe being able to express the trauma narrative. So you've expressed that maybe in some way. But you have had that narrative in your life. It's been disturbing. It's taken away the pleasure. It's often taken away your ability to play, feel alive in your body, because it's scary. It's painful. The thing that I kind of always work towards, and when people are ready to kind of hear this idea, I say, what we really want to work towards is imagining a new narrative. The old one's not really ever going to go away, but it won't take over your life eventually. Right now, it's taken over your life and given you, pain and lack of pleasure. But when we can start to use these tools to start to imagine a new narrative, that will reframe that old one and replace it. And you will still have that experience that you've had, but now you'll be living in a new narrative that you've created. And the arts are really helpful for that because you can't actually, I don't think, I mean, unless you're a very skillful talk therapist, talk people into this. They have to feel it in their body somehow. So we have to get them involved in something where they're action oriented. And that's what I think, that's the real crux of this whole approach with expressive arts therapy is getting to the imagination. Now, I should say one more thing. It's very hard sometimes in the beginning, if trauma survivors are listening to this. Imagination sometimes is blocked. Because when you go to imagination, a lot of things stir up that can be very painful too, that are related to imagination. So to work with the therapist over time and develop that self-regulation through the arts, develop that sense of safety, those are all the foundations that have to take place in order to start to very slowly approach that imagination and develop it and develop the sense of aliveness through that imagination to replace that old narrative. Yeah, so it's a new area of work. We're just starting to realize now that creating art in some sense says that we're looking towards a future. There's a different future out there, and then that's what imagination's about, is imagining something new. So if we're stuck in that old story, there is hope that we can get out of that, and we all have this imaginative capacity. Everybody has it to some extent. And the other thing I think I should bring up too is people think like, okay, he wants me to be creative in these sessions. I very rarely use that word. I say we might get to that. You might enjoy using that word, but I say everybody's expressive somehow. I say even if you just make one mark on paper, you've expressed something, and it may not necessarily be creative, but you're starting that process of imagination because you've taken that first step. So, that's the other thing I think that people need to understand, because sometimes people say, oh, I don't feel creative, but everybody's expressive. So they can express in some way.
Yeah, and I like the imagination piece that you just said was how it's imagining hope. It's imagining a different future that's better and different than what you've experienced thus far, and that's kind of, does that help unlock that in when they go to talk to a therapist and when they go to do other parts of treatment?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's different for everybody. There's some commonalities, but I think the process of introducing that idea, and they've maybe never heard that before, that you can imagine your way into a new way of looking at your life. And sometimes if it's appropriate, I share that that's a way that I've gotten through things too. I've we've all been there. We've been in a situation of loss or separation or rejection, betrayal. People have had complex stories in their life, and, they're pretty horrifying stories. But I've found that I can start to imagine and fantasize these different things, different endings to it. And if you keep doing it, it kind of starts to stick. Our brain's very malleable that way. Our brain can believe something imaginative as much as it can believe something that's right there in reality. So I think with the arts, so you have these pleasurable experiences that are action-oriented that start to support that kind of thing. And these can be very simple, because sometimes I think, well, if a practitioner is listening to this, they're thinking, well, I have to be very artistic. And you can get people started through gesture, through just that mark making, through you saying, okay, you have a worry today. Can you show me in color, shapes, and lines what that is on this piece of paper? What color is it? Is it blue? Is it red? Is it green? Is it a lot of different colors? Can you show me through a gesture what you're feeling like right now? Those are the simple ways to develop that language of imagination.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because I imagine, approaching the idea of making art is intimidating for a lot of people who don't experience. How do you help them overcome that skepticism?
Well, just a little bit right there when I said, use gesture to, just show me through a gesture what you're feeling right now. You're feeling clenched inside. Are you feeling like in your gut some kind of pain? So I'm showing you right now in a gesture what that is. It can be as simple as that. So we have to help people develop that language. It's just like learning a language. So if they've never done art before and never really, done any drawing, how do we start? Just with line, with shape and all these things. And you keep doing it, and all of a sudden, maybe I want to include that color, or that line. What's really helpful too is I see a lot of people in groups, and group work is really helpful for trauma survivors through the arts because they see what other people are doing. And I'm always like, oh, it's okay to look over at somebody else's. Hey, try that out because it resonated with you. So yeah, try that color, try what they did with the gesture. Because that's the other thing that happens in trauma. There are some people that they have a hard time coming up with the ideas, the talk, the expression, but they can gather it from other people who are essentially in the same boat with them. They're all bringing something to the table. It's painful, and they start to get that from each other. There's a lot of dynamic kind of expression that goes on within a group. So working with your therapist as an individual, it can be very helpful. But I always say if we can get into a group situation, it's very helpful for trauma survivors to see and hear what somebody else is saying, and then to see what they're doing too through the arts.
Yeah. And so here at the conference, you're speaking to a lot of people who are doing this work, out on the front lines with addiction and mental health. What are some tips you gave them? What's your message for them of how they can integrate this in what they're doing? Take this back to their work. The expressive arts.
Yeah, there's a lot of simple techniques that we'll be talking about actually in a workshop today. And part of that has to do with just using some basic materials, because a lot of people work in an office, right? They don't have a big art studio. I oftentimes just work in an office where I have to kind of create the studio environment and create spaces for things to happen. But to use, just felt markers and oil pastels, regular size copy paper, and this can be a slow process. I think a therapist who wants to start to bring this in has to also engage in that and really perform that themselves and experience it. And that's, I think, happens in these workshops, especially at these conferences. People start to get that feeling of like, yeah, I can do this. I can be improvisational. Now they can take that to the client work. Yeah, you have to have that your own playful spirit as well, and your enthusiasm.
You have to be bringing that yourself.
Yeah, you have to bring it, because you are going to carry a lot of energy for people who are quite depressed, quite in a lot of pain that's preoccupying them. And how do we get them out of that, for even if it's just a moment for that 90-minute session or that half-hour session? How do we get them out of that? Because once they have that one experience, there's something to build on there. And people do remember, too. I find there's clients that now contact me. They were 30 years ago. Yeah, and kind of gives away how long I've been around.
But it meant a lot to them.
Yeah,
obviously.
But it meant a lot to them. And if I ask them what it was that they remember, it was always the sensory thing that we did. Yeah, and I work with disaster relief as well. And it's really interesting. I'll come in there. We'll have a lot of profound talks. It would be after like a tornado or something like this, because I live in the Midwest. And if I see them months or, even a year later and say, what do you remember? Oh, we remember we did that big drawing. And you played music. We don't remember where the music went, but we all drew together.
Because it engages all the senses.
It's engaging all that. And, And, I can remember myself all the profound things that got said. People cried, or, they did expressed all kinds of things, emotions. They remember that piece. So it becomes very embodied, what you do with them. So the talk is not remembered as well as the experience. What they felt becomes the most important thing.
Yeah. And so we've talked about some ways to integrate this in with other, mental health programs, trauma programs, addiction programs, but it's not everywhere yet. It's still on that process. So what would you say to somebody who maybe is in this work and they're not doing it, and they're like, oh, well, that's just another thing I have to add?
Oh, I know.
What do you say to them to say that, no, this is important. It can be really vital.
Well, the one thing I was just thinking is, I went back last year and I trained with Francis Shapiro in EMDR way back when Francis Shapiro was alive and just teaching, eye movement work. And I went back last year and got training again, because there's a lot of improvement and there's a lot more research. So we're all at this place of like, oh, which thing do I pick from the menu? So I chose to pick that from the menu. But in doing so, when I went through the class, I had an excellent instructor. I was saying to myself, wow, I'm really seeing a connection here between my expressive arts work and how I can integrate it with this EMDR in a much better way. But I think that's the nice thing about expressive arts. You can take any philosophy or approach that we're already using and infuse it with it. So if people are doing cognitive behavioral therapy, you can make that value added by adding the expressive arts. So even if they come and take a very simple workshop, I think people, if they have an orientation that they really work from, they start to see the connection. They can put that together with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So for someone listening who wants to dive in even deeper on learning about this topic, what's one or two books, resources that you'd point them to?
Well, the next book will be the one. It's not out yet, and it's Trauma and Expressive Arts Therapy, Brain, Body, and Imagination in the Healing Process.
And that's going to be your forthcoming book.
And I very rarely pitch books. I'm not a book pitcher, but I really tried to put this book together so that people with a variety of orientations that are working with trauma in particular will be able to look and say, wow, yes, now I know how to use these things from a variety of art forms, movement or music or sound or visual art. But the other one I always recommend, because a lot of therapists feel most comfortable starting with the art piece. So with the felt markers and paper and oil pastels or something really collage, so just magazine pictures and those kinds of things, is the Art Therapy Source Book. That's been around for a while. The reason I suggest that one is for clients, they can use that too. It has a lot of exercises in it that the therapist can say, oh, maybe you should do this, between sessions.
Yeah. All right. Well, to leave listeners with one last thing, what's a favorite piece of advice? Something that's meant a lot to you, something that you'd want to leave listeners with?
Wow, that's always a hard one. Well, I think the thing that I've learned over the last 10 years, this is about the time period I've worked with the military. And I started out working with children. Actually, I was invited to work with children first. But then my first group that I worked with was Navy SEALs. And they saw the value in it, and they wanted to get involved as family. And then also just as adults and couples. It's the fact that we need an integrated approach, so don't be afraid of that. Infuse art, but infuse movement, because I think that's the core right there. Actually, that would be my basic recommendation, to really think about, the principles that Peter Levine has presented. Bessel van der Kolk's talked about this. Pat Ogden, who does work with sensory motor psychotherapy. We have people coming in with trauma, and a lot of times the worst thing that can happen that really triggers or reinforces the post-traumatic stress is being frozen in that trauma. And getting people to move in some way is a really important thing. So they can move on paper, drawing, but to get them up and move in any which way is a really important thing that starts to get them feeling like they're empowered and that they're active in their own treatment. And that's, one thing I just constantly say to people, and keep it in my own life. I dance every day.
You're practicing what you preach.
Oh, yes.
Dr. Cathy Malchiodi is a psychologist, art therapist, educator, and author based in Louisville, Kentucky. Learn more about her work, including her new book called Trauma and Expressive Arts Therapy, at cathymalchiodi.com. Beyond Theory is produced, written, and edited by me, David Condos. You can discover more from this podcast, including more conversations from the U.S. Journal Training Conference in Arizona, at beyondtheorypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Beyond Theory.